They feared him enough to lower their voices when he entered a room. I had watched it happen at 3 different events before the night everything changed. The subtle shift in posture, the way conversations became quieter and more careful, the way even powerful people seemed to remember their manners. Victor Kane had that effect. He didn't have to announce himself. The room did it for him. But the night he chose to stand beside me, the woman they said he should never touch, everything they thought they knew about power began to fall apart. I was not the kind of woman who appeared in Victor Kane's orbit. I was the one who set up the microphone stand before his name was even mentioned on the program. I was the one who made sure the flowers were placed correctly and the seating was corrected before anyone arrived. I was the one nobody looked at directly but everyone expected to have done their job. I had spent years making myself precisely that invisible, and I had thought it was working. The night of the Meridian Charitable Foundation Gala proved me wrong. That was the night the past found me in a room I had been certain I was too small to matter in. My name is Hannah. I am 30 years old, and what I am is steady. Not glamorous, not ambitious in the way that gets noticed, not the woman who walks into a room and changes it. I am the woman who sets up the room before anyone else arrives and stays until after everyone else has left. I work as an event coordinator for a mid-tier company that takes on high-profile clients, galas, corporate dinners, charity evenings attended by the kinds of people who have enough money that other people's money stops interesting them. I organize details. I manage vendors. I solve problems the guests never know existed. I am good at my job, which means I am good at being invisible. At home I am the opposite. I am everything to my younger brother Noah, who is 22 and studying mechanical engineering and who depends on me with a completeness that shapes every decision I make. Our parents are gone. That is the short version. The longer version involves a scandal, false accusations, and a reputation destroyed by people with more resources than integrity. Noah was too young when it happened to carry the weight the way I do. I carry it alone. I have been carrying it for 8 years. My father's name was Gerald Reeves. He was a mid-level financial advisor at a firm he had worked at for 17 years, a man of modest ambitions and careful habits who believed that doing the right thing was its own protection. He was wrong. When I was 22 and Noah was 14, someone at that firm decided a mid-level advisor with 17 years of records was a useful person to blame for fraudulent transactions that reached much higher in the organization than anyone would acknowledge. My father was investigated, publicly named, and professionally destroyed over 8 months. The charges were eventually reduced and dismissed, but by then, the dismissal was a small article on an inside page, and the original accusations had been front-page news. My mother did not survive the year after. She had never been well, and the stress of it finished something already fragile. My father died 4 years later, quietly, of the accumulated weight of a reputation that had been taken from him. I was 26. Noah was 18. I had 2 years of grief behind me and everything else still ahead. I decided the only way through was to keep moving without looking back. I had been hired to coordinate the Meridian Charitable Foundation Gala 6 weeks before it happened. It was not the kind of event my company usually landed. The guest list was heavy with names that appeared on the business pages of national publications. My supervisor, Clara, had put in for the contract and won it, and she had assigned me because I was reliable and because she trusted me not to be overwhelmed by rooms full of important people. She was right about the reliability. She had not accounted for the specific density of the past that would be concentrated in that room. I should have flagged it when I received the initial guest list and saw certain names. I recognized one immediately, Elliot Foss, the man who had chaired the internal committee that recommended my father for investigation all those years ago. He was now a prominent donor to the foundation. I looked at his name for a long time. Then I made a note in my coordination folder and continued working, because that was what I did. The professional world I worked in overlapped with the world that had destroyed my family. I had learned to navigate that intersection the only way I knew, by keeping my head down and my hands moving. Victor Kane's name appeared on the final seating chart 2 weeks before the event. He was placed at the center table, reserved for the evening's most significant guests, in a position that indicated the foundation understood exactly who he was to them. Victor Kane was, depending on who you asked, either the most respected or the most feared businessman in the city. He had built his primary holdings in private equity, with extensive interests in real estate, media, and logistics. He was not known for philanthropy. His attendance at the gala was itself a form of announcement. I had read his profile in the briefing documents the way I read all guest profiles, carefully, neutrally, without investment. I noted that he was 41, had never married, and had a public profile notable for what it did not include. No scandals. No visible personal life. No statements that weren't precise. He was, in the language of event coordination, a high-priority guest requiring no special accommodation. Those were, in my experience, frequently the most interesting people in any room. I filed his profile alongside the others and returned to the seating logistics, which had 3 complications that needed resolving before the week was out. The evening of the gala, I arrived at the venue at 3 in the afternoon for a 7 o'clock start. Those 4 hours were mine, the quiet time when everything could still be corrected before anyone with influence arrived to notice it. I moved through the venue with my clipboard and earpiece and the focused energy that came from knowing exactly where things tended to go wrong. The flowers along the east wall blocked the sightline from the VIP entrance to the stage. I had them repositioned. An audio technician had run a cable that created a trip hazard near the presentation area. I had it rerouted. The catering station for the first service was placed too close to the first cluster of tables, which would cause a bottleneck during arrival. I had it moved. These were small things. They were the things that made the difference between an evening that felt seamless and one that accumulated friction. I was the person who noticed them so that no one else had to. By 6:30, the room was ready. I stood in the east corridor for 2 minutes, reviewing my checklist, and then I took my position near the entrance for the arrival phase. The guests began arriving at 7:15. I was positioned near the entrance, visible enough to redirect any logistical issue, invisible enough not to draw attention. I watched the room fill with men who carried themselves with the ease of people who had stopped proving themselves to anyone some years back. The women were their own study, some with the same ease, some with the careful brightness of people who understood that visibility in rooms like this required performance. I watched faces I recognized from briefing documents and faces I recognized from 8 years of careful memory. Elliot Foss arrived at 7:27. He was thinner than in my memory, which was mostly constructed from news photographs. He arrived with a woman who laughed frequently and a handshake he deployed like a tool. I watched him move through the room and I felt nothing in particular, which surprised me. I had expected anger. What I felt instead was a kind of dull clarity, the recognition of a familiar shape. He had not changed. The room had simply given him a new context to fill. I returned to my checklist and noted the arrival time and moved on to the next thing, which was confirming the first service timing with the kitchen team. Victor Kane arrived at 8:15, later than his listed time but precisely when a man of his specific variety of power would choose to arrive. The room did the thing I had observed before, the tightening, the reorientation, the quiet. He was taller than I had expected from photographs, and he moved with an economy of motion that I recognized as the deliberate kind, not natural ease but practiced restraint. He wore a dark suit with the comfortable fit of something made for him, and he had the quality of stillness that very controlled people use as authority. He spoke to no one immediately. He took a glass from a passing tray, stood for a moment surveying the room, and then began moving toward the center table at a pace that indicated he had somewhere to be but was choosing not to hurry. I watched him for approximately 45 seconds from my position near the east wall and then returned to my clipboard. I had 4 check-ins remaining before the first service and a recognition speech scheduled in 30 minutes. Watching Victor Kane was not in my job description. I was very good at staying within my job description. The event's first hour went smoothly. The catering service was timed correctly, the ambient music was at the right level, the lighting transitioned through the planned sequence without incident. I moved through the edges of the room, checking in with my team through the earpiece, making small adjustments no guest would notice. I was aware of Elliot Foss at his table. I had placed him in my peripheral awareness the way you monitor something that might require attention. He was gregarious, loud in a contained way, comfortable. The women I had clocked earlier, seated at the western table, had assessed me once briefly when I crossed their sight line. I was wearing my work clothes, professional, practical, nothing that announced anything. Their gaze said not relevant. I returned to my clipboard. That kind of assessment I had received so many times in rooms like this that it had become functionally invisible to me. I had spent years developing that particular immunity. The injury of being dismissed by people like this had been absorbed so thoroughly that it no longer registered as injury. It registered simply as data, information about the room's hierarchy that I noted and then moved past. At 9:15, the host took the stage for the recognition portion of the evening. This was the segment I had coordinated most carefully. 6 speakers, a presentation component, and a short film on the screens above the stage. The logistics required precise timing. When my name appeared on the production sheet as the person managing the presentation board near the stage, I had noted it without concern. I was often present in this capacity during technical moments. I took my position beside the stage. This meant standing in front of the room in a way I was not normally required to do. I was visible, not as a guest, not as someone of note, but as the staff member handling the technical element. I had stood in similar positions before. The difference I did not anticipate was that Elliot Foss was seated in the 3rd row with a direct sightline to where I was standing, and that he recognized me. I could see it happen from across the room, the small calculation that moved through his face when his eyes found mine and placed them in context. Then his expression arranged itself into something that was not quite a smile but had the same shape. Elliot Foss waited until the host finished the introduction before he spoke. He did it with the practiced ease of a man who knew how to make a statement sound like casual commentary, pitched to carry, but wrapped in the register of a joke. He said it was interesting to see all the resilience being honored, that some people were more resilient than others, and that some people had a particular talent for finding their way back into rooms they had never quite earned the right to be in. He said it lightly. Some guests near him laughed, the automatic laughter of people who respond to social confidence rather than content. Others glanced in my direction, connecting the dots. The comment was precise in its cruelty. It referenced nothing specific enough to be challenged, but everyone nearby who knew anything about my family understood what had just been said. I stood beside the presentation board with my hands at my sides, and I did not change my expression. I had learned a long time ago that in rooms like this, the expression you show in a difficult moment becomes part of the record. I was not going to give Elliot Foss anything to file away. The laughter faded. The host moved on with the momentum of someone who had not fully tracked what had just happened. The guests who had laughed settled back into attention. Those who had understood looked away, which was its own particular response. Not cruelty, just the studied indifference of people who had decided that involvement was more costly than silence. I had grown up with this after my father's scandal, the specific feeling of being publicly diminished while the people around you chose, one by one, to look at something else rather than intervene. I stood with my clipboard. I breathed steadily. I focused on the presentation cue coming in approximately 90 seconds and on the fact that my job was to make the next 15 minutes go correctly, and that my personal history had no legitimate place in my professional performance. No one needed me to keep this job. The room's opinion of me was not a variable I could afford to engage with. I had made my peace with that long before tonight. But the weight of it, in this particular room, with this specific comment still hanging in the air, it pressed on me with a heaviness I had not expected. Then Victor Kane stood up. I did not see him rise. I was focused on the presentation panel and the approaching cue. What I noticed first was the change in the room's quality. The particular shift that I had learned to associate with his presence happened again, but differently this time. Not the deferential tightening of his arrival, but something sharper and more alert. A held breath. I looked up. He was on his feet. He was not looking at Elliot Foss. He was not looking at the host. He was looking at me. His expression was calm, not warm exactly, but the opposite of cold. It was the focused expression of someone who has made a decision and is executing it without ambiguity. He said, in the level, carrying voice of a man accustomed to rooms that listened when he chose to speak, "I think a clarification is needed." The room went very still. Victor Kane did not make remarks at events. Whatever he was about to say had received the room's full, silent attention before he had finished the sentence. I remained beside the presentation panel. My cue was 40 seconds away. My hands were completely steady. Victor spoke for perhaps 2 minutes. He did not raise his voice or turn the moment into theatre. He spoke in the measured tone of someone presenting information they have considered carefully. He said that humor at the expense of someone's family history, particularly a history shaped by forces beyond their control, was not humor at all. He said that some people in this room had very specific reasons to understand the difference between a reputation damaged by circumstance and one damaged by truth. He said this without looking at Elliot Foss, which was more devastating than looking at him would have been. The room understood the direction. He did not need to point. Then he said something I had not expected, that the Reeves name was one he had encountered in his own professional history, and that what he had found was not what had been publicly suggested 8 years ago. He said it as a statement of fact, in front of people for whom reputation was currency. He sat down. The silence that followed had a different quality from any silence I had experienced in a professional setting. It was the silence of a room reassessing something it had been certain of. I executed my presentation cue at the correct moment. The film played. The recognition portion continued. I did this on a kind of autopilot that I was grateful for, the professional training that keeps your hand steady when the rest of you is somewhere else entirely. My father's name had just been spoken aloud in a room full of the most powerful people in the city. Not with shame, but with something adjacent to vindication, by a man whose words carried considerable authority. I stood beside my presentation board and I did not cry. I had not cried in a professional setting in 8 years and I was not going to begin now. But I felt something shift inside me that I could not immediately categorize. Something held very tightly for a very long time had been touched, and the touching of it released a pressure I had not known was there. The program continued around me. The host moved through the segments with professional smoothness. The guests reconfigured their attention. I stood in my position and waited for the next cue and thought about my father and what it might have meant to him to have his name spoken that way. The recognition segment concluded at 9:55. I stepped away from the presentation area and returned to my peripheral position, moving, checking, adjusting, managing the invisible machinery of the event. The room had not returned to its pre-speech quality. The atmosphere was charged in a way that galas rarely were, creating its own logistical considerations. Conversations were more animated with the energy of people processing something unexpected. I kept my eyes on my checklist and my pace steady. A colleague on my team, a younger man named Theo, came to check in and looked at me with an expression that said he had understood what had happened and was unsure how to respond to it. I told him we were on track for the final service and asked him to confirm the dessert timing with the kitchen. He went. The group of women I had clocked earlier had changed dynamic. One was speaking more quietly than before, and the others were listening more carefully than they had been when assessing the room with their earlier evaluative certainty. I filed this away and continued moving. The evening still had 90 minutes to run and I had work to do. Victor Kane found me at 10:20, near the east wall where I had repositioned the flowers that afternoon. He appeared in my peripheral vision with the same economical movement I had observed earlier in the evening. He did not begin with pleasantries. He said, "You're the coordinator for this evening." I said yes. He looked at me for a moment, direct, without the social softening most people apply to initial interactions. He said, "I knew your father's case. Not well, but well enough." I said nothing immediately. There was no safe response available to me that was also honest, and I had spent too many years performing the wrong responses to manufactured situations to do it again when something real was in front of me. After a moment I said that I appreciated what he had done. He said he had done what was accurate, without seeking credit, without making it larger than its practical dimensions. He asked how Noah was. I looked at him when he said that. He knew my brother's name. He said he had done some reading. I asked why. He said that was a longer conversation than we were currently in a position to have. I did not ask for that longer conversation that night. I had a job to finish, 2 service checks, a final coordination meeting with the venue manager, the sign-out process for my team. I thanked Victor briefly and returned to my checklist. The event concluded at 11:30. I stayed until 12:45, confirmed the overnight security arrangements, and walked to my car in the parking structure 2 blocks away. I sat in the driver's seat for a while. I thought about my father. I thought about what Victor had said and what he had not said. I thought about the name Reeves, which I had spent 8 years avoiding in professional contexts, now spoken aloud with a quiet authority that made it something other than a liability. Noah texted at 12:50 asking if I was okay because I had not texted to say I was leaving. I texted back, "Yes. A long night. Tell you tomorrow." Then I started the car and drove home through the empty city, feeling something I could not name that was not quite grief and not quite relief but somewhere in the territory between them. A pressure released. A weight redistributed. Something, finally, slightly different. 3 days after the gala, Clara called me into her office. She had the expression of someone who has received information good for the business and is still processing how to share it. She told me the Meridian Foundation had sent a personal commendation for the coordination quality of the evening, and my name had been specifically mentioned. She also said, with a slight shift in her expression, that a representative from Victor Kane's office had been in contact requesting I be assigned as sole coordinator for an upcoming private event hosted by one of his affiliated organizations. She said it was a significant contract and she was inclined to accept it, and she was asking if I had any concerns about the assignment. I thought about the East Wall flowers and the rerouted cable and my father's name in a room full of powerful people. I thought about Victor saying that was a longer conversation. I said I had no concerns. Clara slid the contract brief across her desk. I picked it up and began reading with the same careful neutrality I applied to all briefing documents, and the only thing that gave me away was that I read the first page twice. The weeks that followed were different in quality from the ones before them. Not dramatically. I still went to work, managed my events, made dinner for Noah on Sundays, ran in the mornings. But there were differences around the edges of that life that I noticed and kept track of. People from the gala circuit who had previously moved past me with their eyes ahead began making brief, direct contact, not warmth, exactly, but acknowledgement. A senior figure from one of the foundation's partner organizations sent my company a referral specifically requesting me by name. Elliot Foss, I heard through the ambient information of professional networks, had stepped back from 2 board positions in the weeks following the gala. I did not know if this was connected to that evening. It didn't matter to me in the way it might have once. What I noticed more was Noah, who knew none of the details but told me one Sunday evening that I seemed different. He said it directly, the way 22-year-olds say things. He said I seemed less like I was waiting for something bad to happen. I said I didn't know what he meant. He said yes I did. He was right. The private event Victor's organization had contracted me for was a small dinner. 12 guests, high profile, requiring discreet and precise coordination. I arrived 3 hours early, as I always did. Victor was already there when I arrived, reviewing something on a tablet at the venue's working table. He looked up when I came in with the immediate, accurate attention of a person always aware of what is in the room. He said good evening. I said good evening and put down my coordinator bag and began my setup process. The venue was smaller than the gala space, more intimate, which created different logistical requirements that I had already mapped in my preparation documents. He watched me work for about 10 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "I want to tell you what I know about your father." I stopped what I was doing. I had been waiting for this, not with impatience, but with the quiet readiness of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and understands that setting it down requires both hands free. I put down my clipboard. I looked at him directly and without reservation. I said, "Then tell me." What Victor told me was not the complete picture. He was clear about that from the beginning. He had come across the Reeves matter in the context of an investigation into a different financial network that intersected with my father's former firm at several points. What he had found suggested strongly that the internal investigation had been directed by people who needed a credible fall figure, someone whose level in the organization made him plausible, whose integrity made him unprepared to fight aggressively, and whose limited resources made sustained legal defense difficult. He had shared what he knew with a legal contact, and the question of whether a formal re-examination of the record was possible was actively being looked into. He said all of this precisely, without sentiment. He said he could be wrong about elements of it. He said he thought I deserved to know what he knew, regardless of whether it led anywhere formal. I sat with all of this for a moment. Then I said, Why did you read about us at all? He said, because you're the only person at 4 separate events who has done this job perfectly. I wanted to understand why someone like that was invisible. The dinner went well. The guests arrived, the evening moved through its segments with the precision I had planned for, and I managed the logistics from the edge of the room with the same invisible competence I brought to every event. Victor hosted with the economy of manner I had observed at the gala, present, attentive, entirely without performance. His guests were significant people who treated me the way significant people treat event staff, which is to say they didn't. Except one, a woman named Iris who ran a legal advocacy organization, stopped me near the east side of the room and asked if I was the coordinator who had been at the Meridian Gala. When I said yes, she said she had heard about the evening in a way that told me she was not referring to the florals. She gave me her business card and said that if I ever wanted to discuss pursuing a formal record correction for my family, her organization handled those cases. I took the card and put it in my jacket pocket. For the rest of the evening I could feel it there, small and specific, like the beginning of something I had not been prepared to imagine. Noah came to my apartment the following Sunday as usual. We made dinner together, the Sunday routine we had maintained since we were 26 and 18 and suddenly the only family each other had. We ate at my kitchen table and I told him about the gala and about Victor and about what Victor had said regarding our father. I told him carefully, without raising expectations, without suggesting certainty about what it might mean. I told him the way I tried to tell Noah difficult things, with the accuracy he deserved and the steadiness he had always relied on from me. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you believe him?" I thought about it honestly. I said yes. He said, "Good." Then he said that he had never blamed Dad, and that he had never stopped believing the story they told about our father was not who our father was. He said he had been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up to what we already knew. I reached across the table and held his hand for a moment. He let me. Then we finished dinner. I think about power differently now than I did before that gala. I used to think of it as something other people had and I worked around, an ambient force belonging to the guests and not to the coordinator with the clipboard. What I understand now is that power is not always what it looks like from the outside. Victor Kane was feared because he operated with precision and because he understood that information was the most durable form of authority. What he did at the gala was not sentiment. It was precision, saying something true, in the right room, at the right moment, with the right weight behind it. I had spent 8 years believing my only protection was invisibility. The truth was that invisibility had never actually protected me, it had simply deferred the exposure. The night Victor Kane stood up in a room full of people who had decided what I was worth and said something different, I was not saved. I was seen. For the first time in a very long time, I was accurately and completely seen. And the woman who drove home that night understood something she had not understood when she arrived, that her story was not as small as the room had decided. It never had been.